Good morning and welcome to Walnut Creek's 2012 Veterans Day observance. I am Bob Simmons, Mayor of the City of Walnut Creek, and on behalf of the City Council, I do wish to welcome you to this ceremony. I would like you to please rise for the presentation of the colors by Boy Scout Troop 2002, the playing of our national anthem by the Walnut Creek Concert Band, and the Pledge of Allegiance by Councilmember Gary Squell.
Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You may be seated. And thank you to Boy Scout Troop 202 and to the Walnut Creek Concert Band and to Councilmember Sprout. Please let me introduce my colleagues that are up on the stage today. I'll begin with Councilmember Sprout, who just gave the Pledge of Allegiance, Councilmember Christina Lawson, and Councilmember Cindy Silva. And next to her is a gentleman who will be giving the invocation, Reverend Walters. And on my left is Assemblymember Joan Buchanan, County Supervisor Karen Mitchoff, and our keynote speaker, Captain David Yuers. Ceremonies like ours are held today in thousands of communities across the country. What we now recognize as Veterans Day originally was called Armistice Day after World War I. It was the result of a ceasefire on the Western Front of the Great War that occurred on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. After World War II, the name was changed to Veterans Day to recognize the veterans of both world wars. And we now use this day to recognize the service of all of our veterans. These ceremonies acknowledge and pay tribute to the veterans of the United States for their commitment to their nation and for their personal sacrifices so that we, as a nation and as a people, can remain free. They dedicated themselves to protecting our country when their commitment was needed most, and they placed the needs of our country ahead of their own needs. We are grateful to the veterans for their service to our country, and through this ceremony, wish to honor them and to communicate particularly to our local veterans how important they are to each of us. I would now like to introduce Father Sumner Walters. The Reverend Dr. Sumner Walters is here today to give blessing to our ceremony. Father Walters served in World War II as a staff sergeant for the 5th Force in the South Pacific from 1943 to 1946. He served as the cryptographer technician. After returning home, he completed his BA and MA at Stanford and then went to Oxford, England for his PhD. He is a retired Episcopal minister and a resident of Rossmore since 1979. Father Walters.
I'm better than you. Let us pray. Eternal God, through whose mighty power our fathers won their liberties of old, we give you thanks for all who serve our country, and on this day, for the veterans, men and women of our armed forces. We give thanks for the examples of those who, having finished their course in faith, do now rest from their labors. Preserve, we pray, the ideals for which our veterans gave their lives and service. Grant that government of the people, by the people, and for the people may not perish from the earth. Look upon the many peoples dwelling under one government, and take from us all prejudice, hatred, and whatever else may hinder us from godly union and concord. In this time of national difficulty, in this time of trial and contention, raise up again, we pray, wise and righteous leaders, and bring into glad obedience a united nation, strong to do your will. Today we join in honoring the veterans whose sacrifices have made this nation free. Today we dedicate ourselves to the unfinished work they so nobly advanced. The government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to finish the work that they began. Help us to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for all who need our care, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Amen.
Originally described as Operation Enduring Freedom, Horn of Africa, the war in Afghanistan began on October 7, 2001. It is the longest war in U.S. history. As with any war, military intelligence is crucial to success. For example, in stories that we all remember, a principal reason for the success of the Allies in World War II was the breaking of the German Code. And while the purpose of military intelligence, the learning about the enemy's location, its strength, and its plans, remains largely unchanged today, the methods of gathering and analyzing critical information have evolved just as the technology of war has evolved. Moreover, these days, military intelligence gathering is not limited to wartime, just as the U-2 incident in 1960 demonstrated. But that incident also demonstrated how the technology of intelligence gathering had changed, because it was the first time that many of us knew that we were using high elevation planes to take very detailed photos of actions and activities on the ground. And now we have spy satellite photography that identifies developments on the ground with great precision. And this is important not only in identifying potential violations of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in countries like Korea and Iran, but it is clear that Osama bin Laden would not have been discovered and killed but for the very precise military intelligence that determined his location. For our speaker this year, we are very pleased that Captain David Yuers is here. Captain Yuers joined the regular Air Force in 1982 as an aircraft weapons chief, and then joined the Air National Guard in 1994. From then until 2004, he was stationed with the California Air National Guard's 129th Combat Search and Rescue Wing at Moffett Field. While with the 129th Wing, Captain Yuers trained to become an intelligence analyst, and in 2004, he earned a commission with the United States Air Force Reserve. Since then, Captain Yuers has been deployed on 8 separate occasions, and his last deployment was to Djibouti, Africa, in the Horn of Africa, and he has returned home in August. His decorations include the Air Force Commendations Medal, the Army Commendation Medal, the Air Force Achievement Medal, the Joint Service Achievement Medal, the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, the Global War on Terrorism Expeditionary Medal, the Air Force Outstanding Unit Award with Valor, and the Operation Iraqi Freedom Campaign Medal. Captain Yuers has about a 17-minute slideshow presentation, and the screen will be coming down for that. I'm going to ask my colleagues to join me down in this first row so that we can enjoy watching the presentation from Captain David Yuers.
Thanks. Thank you, Mayor Simmons, the City Council, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I also want to put a little word out to the Warriors Watch. Mr. Brian Weldon is out here, does fantastic work here in the community for returning veterans in the East Bay. We definitely appreciate the work you and your volunteers have done, sir. And the other veteran service organizations. Thank you for being here. I am honored to be asked to speak. And since I was asked to speak about my experiences, I will start at the beginning, way at the beginning. So there's going to be a little bit of history in this presentation as well. I grew up in the East Bay in a very patriotic household. And at the age of 5, my father took me to an air show at Buchanan Field. Since then, I have been fascinated with military aircraft. So the answer to the question of why I joined the Air Force is, from the age of 5, there never really was a question. While my friends were building models of rockets, or trains, or ships, or hot rods, I was fascinated with aircraft and building every model I could afford on my allowance. Like I said to some of the Boy Scouts prior to this presentation, the merit badge I was most proud of earning as a Boy Scout was the Aviation Merit Badge. And while my friends were into Daniel Boone or Matt Dillon, Superman, Batman, Captain Kirk, and Spock, or Tarzan and Sherlock Holmes. These were my fictitious heroes, always military aviators. As I grew older, I grew to admire real-life heroes. The images you see were recognizable to any schoolboy when I was young. And if you're old enough, you remember learning about Eddie Rickenbacker, the ace of aces in the First World War. In the last 6 months of World War I, Captain Rickenbacker shot down 26 enemy aircraft in the SPAD-16 and earned the Medal of Honor. Another aviator who earned the Medal of Honor was the Lone Eagle, Colonel Charles Lindbergh. I was also fascinated by the Flying Tigers, started by General Claire Chennault, and one of their top aces, Colonel Robert Scott, who wrote the book, God is My Co-Pilot. Probably one of my greatest heroes was General Jimmy Doolittle, an innovator and pioneer in aviation. He's probably most remembered for leading the bombing raid on Tokyo less than 5 months after Pearl Harbor. There was another man who earned the Medal of Honor, Richard Bond, our top ace in World War II, with 40 confirmed kills. And of course, the man who at one time was the fastest man alive, Chuck Yeager, a triple ace, and the first man to break the sound barrier. When I was still young, I deeply admired the adventures of two of our Vietnam aces, Robin Olds, an ace in World War II and Vietnam, and Captain Steve Ritchie, the last ace this country has ever had and still a personal hero of mine. I was convinced I was going to grow up to be a fighter ace myself, until I saw the optometrist when I was 17 and discovered I had to wear these. There was no LASIK in those days, and the Air Force required then, as it still does, that all of their pilots have 20/20 vision. I decided if I could be a flyer, I would be a fixer, so I became a weapons crew chief so I could at least work on the aircraft and their weapon systems. In the summer of 1982, I went to boot camp and became an airman in the United States Air Force. It was a different world when I joined. The Soviet Union had occupied Afghanistan for 3 years and had proxies in Nicaragua over the last 2 years as well. Leonid Brezhnev was still running the Soviet Union, and during my first enlistment, he was replaced by Yuri Andropov and then Konstantin Churenko. The Cold War was still chilly, and the Soviet Union was still a threat to the free world. Finally, the Soviet leaders stopped dying off when they chose this young man, Mikhail Gorbachev, to be their party chairman. And the Cold War quickly began to thaw when Gorbachev met the man who would bring the Cold War to its end. During this time, I was stationed in the High Mojave Desert of California at a base that has been closed for 20 years now, George Air Force Base. The main attraction in that area was the Roy Rogers and Dale Evans Museum. Other than being located between Victorville and Atlanta, there wasn't much else that made the base stand out. But if you enjoyed the desert, and I did, it was a great place to be stationed. So here was the aircraft I worked on, the F-4 Phantom. A dream come true for me, since it was the fighter plane that had been in dogfights in Vietnam, and I was reading about them while growing up, and some of the aircraft I work on still had MiG kills stamped next to their cockpits. While the pilots and older enlisted crew I worked with were Vietnam veterans as well. As you can see, the mission was quite interesting. The Phantom's job was to ferret out anything on the ground that could shoot down any of our aircraft and neutralize that threat. So when a package of attack, fighter, and bomber aircraft went in anywhere, the Weasels were the first in and the last to leave. This was the squadron I belonged to, the 561st. This was the logo of the Phantom. This was the motto of the Wild Weasels. You've got to be kidding me. And this was the aircraft that I would spend the next decade turning wrenches on. The WW on the tail surface stood for Wild Weasel. The only thrill I had larger than working on this aircraft was the occasional ride I got in the back seat. These are pictures taken of me 50 pounds ago of my first ride in the back seat of an F-4. One of the happier days of my Air Force career, to say the least. This picture was taken after my first ride, and that smile you see there is genuine. All I could think about is, when do I get to do this again? Fortunately, I had several opportunities. Now, here are some images of the Iron Curtain that fell across Europe during the Cold War. I present these because some of you younger folks may not remember this. As you can see, Eastern Europe was under Soviet domination at the time. I also mention this since my squadron deployed to what was then called West Germany, to a Luftwaffe air base in 1989. The deployment was called a checkered flag because in the event we went to war with the Soviet Union, this is where we would go, to the front lines, so to speak. Now, before I left for West Germany, my mother told me that my passport had expired and that I should renew it. At the time, I was still young enough to believe I was smarter than my mother. And so I told her that since I was on military orders, I would not need a passport to go to Germany and return to the United States. Our deployment was for a month, from the middle of October to the middle of November. This is in 1989. Well, guess what happened? Before the Iron Curtain fell, the Berlin Wall fell. And when did it fall? While I was there. But could I go there and witness this history? As you can see, West Berlin and East Berlin were both in East Germany. And the only way anyone could travel to Berlin was if they had a passport. So the lesson learned, always listen to your mother. As you can see, the city of Berlin was divided up into 4 parts: the French, British, and Americans in the west, and the Soviets in the east. The gateway from the Soviet sector of Berlin to the American sector was called Checkpoint Charlie. In the winter of 1989, Soviet communism began to crumble and fall. This is Veterans Day, and we honor the veterans of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars, and Afghanistan. I would also like to honor the veterans of the Cold War, the men and women who sailed nuclear submarines through the Barents Sea, patrolled the skies over the Hungarian border, manned radar stations in Greenland, intercepted Soviet bombers heading towards Alaska, maintained the missile silos in our heartland, stood on watch in Cheyenne Mountain, stood on alert bomber crews, and manned the gates at Checkpoint Charlie. From 1947 to 1991, these men and women maintained a silent vigil, being the vanguard on the watchtowers of the free world. Unheralded and unsung, yet, in the words of Ronald Reagan, indispensable. Most of them were never combat veterans. Yet due to their diligence, all of Europe is now free. And the children of this country no longer have nightmares about the threat of nuclear annihilation. If you are a veteran of the Cold War, I salute you and thank you for your service. So there I am as a sergeant. I've got 3 stripes on my sleeve, a few ribbons on my chest, and a couple of badges on my pockets. The Cold War is over. I have served from 1982 to 1990, 2 enlistments, and now I'm ready to get out. August 2nd, 1990 was my 26th birthday. I was in a good mood. I was on terminal leave, getting ready to leave, celebrate my birthday, when I heard that Iraq had invaded Kuwait. I thought to myself, so what? Iraq had just had an 8-year war with Iran, and now they were fighting Kuwait. Just another war in the Mideast. That won't affect me. Wrong. That week, as I was out processing, I was informed I wasn't going anywhere. The United States was going to liberate Kuwait, and I was going to stay in uniform until we did. How were they going to keep me in? They were going to use something I had never heard of. That was the first time I heard of stop loss. So the Weasels deployed in August of 1990 to Bahrain, an island in the Persian Gulf, for Operation Desert Shield. The president said Iraq had until the 16th of January to leave Kuwait. Iraq stayed in Kuwait, and so on the 17th of January, Operation Desert Shield became Operation Desert Storm. The Air Force really got to show its stuff, and the American public, the world, and the Iraqis all learned how important air power was. The Weasels were the first ones in, and after a week, the entire Air Force dominated the skies. After a month of continuous bombing, the Army and Marines went in, and the shortest ground war in the history of the United States took place. By the 28th of February, a little bit over a month, Operation Desert Storm was over. After Desert Storm, we put in the no-fly zones over Iraq so that Saddam Hussein could not use aircraft to persecute the Shias in the south of Iraq or the Kurds in the north. I would get to know the no-fly zones quite well throughout the 90s. Operation Provide Comfort was a humanitarian effort to help the Kurds that later evolved into Operation Northern Watch. Those missions were flown out of Turkey. Operation Southern Watch was flown out of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Here is one of the many patches that came out of Desert Storm. Airmen love patches. And here's another one. If you want to make an airman happy, give him a patch. And this is a print of one of our Wild Weasels firing an anti-radar missile used to take out surface-to-air missile sites. By the time Desert Storm was over, there weren't many SAM sites left in Iraq. As I said before, I would get to know the no-fly zones real well in the 90s. No Iraqi aircraft were allowed to fly north of Al Sulaymaniyah or south of Baghdad. The main reason for my intimate familiarity at the no-fly zones was due to stop loss coming to an end and my leaving the regular Air Force to join the California Air National Guard. After a couple of years in the Air National Guard working on the weapon systems of the C-130 and H-860 helicopter, I left the aircraft weapons field and trained to be an intelligence officer instead. This also afforded me the opportunity to fly more. As you can see here, the 129th Rescue Wing had and continues to have 3 weapon systems. The MC-130, powered by 4 turbopropeller engines, it is used for transport, inserting troops, and refueling helicopters. The HH-60, mainly used for inserting and recovering PJs, and the PJs themselves. These guys are the Air Force version of the Army's Green Berets and the Navy SEALs. Their primary mission is to rescue air crews that have to eject and evade capture behind enemy lines. But they also do quite a bit of medevac missions for the Army and Marines. And they recover sensitive and classified equipment. Since they are part of the Guard, they also rescue everybody from sailors who are sick and beyond the range of our Coast Guard to hikers stranded on mountains. Their motto is, "These things we do that others may live." And while I worked with these guys, I can honestly say it was the best mission I ever had. What could be better than helping to save lives? Here is one of the main hangars used by the Guard and 2 of our weapon systems, the rescue aircraft and the rescue helicopter. There's another one of those patches we love so much. The insignia for the 129th Rescue Wing represents war and peace, day and night. This is the main hangar at Moffett Field. It was built for airships by the Navy back in the 1920s and still there. If you're ever driving through Mountain View, you can't miss it. And there's the first weapon system, the C-130. This is the C-130 dispensing flares to protect itself from heat-seeking missiles. And this is the second weapon system, the H-860 Pavehawk. As you can see, the Pavehawk is distinguished from the Blackhawk by the refueling probe in the front, along with the forward-looking infrared chin turret. Here's yours truly, riding in the jump seat of one of the C-130s. It's the best office a man could ask for. And here's one of our C-130s refueling the helicopters. Our PJs not only rescue downed airmen on the ground, but from the water as well. So if a pilot has to eject over the water, the PJs can still go get them. As you can see, the 129th Rescue Wing is one of the few military units still operating out of the Bay Area. Rescue helicopters back in Vietnam were called Jolly Green Giants, and so our PJs have adopted the green feet as their insignia. They are the 3rd and most important weapon system. Any place, any time, day or night, often under heavy fire, the guardian angels put themselves in harm's way, that others may live. It was a privilege to work with them. So, remember those no-fly zones? Throughout the 90s and the beginning of this century, the 129th Rescue Wing would deploy for a month or more to either Turkey or to Kuwait to help enforce the northern no-fly zone or the southern no-fly zone. That little red dot on top of Kuwait there is Ali al-Salim Air Base. It was about 23 miles from the Iraqi border. That's where I was with most of the 129th Combat Search and Rescue Wing on September 11th, 2001. That afternoon, in Kuwait, we learned about United Airlines Flight 93 crashing into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. People that we knew in the Pentagon were emailing us, telling us they were safe after the Pentagon was attacked. And we all saw the second aircraft hitting the Twin Towers in New York. Here we were, thousands of miles away, while our country was being attacked. That was probably one of the most frustrating days of my Air Force career. In the spring of 2003, we were back in Turkey, enforcing the Northern No-Fly Zone. Then Operation Northern Watch became Operation Iraqi Freedom. Most of you will recall the campaign in the south with the big drive from Kuwait, the desert, the sandstorms, and the battles fought up to Baghdad. Our war was a little easier. We flew into Bashir, Iraq in the north to assist in the largest airborne drop since World War II. Resistance was minimal, and to be honest, the Kurdish Peshmerga, their militias, did most of the fighting. Since Saddam Hussein deployed most of his forces in the south, only members of the Ba'athist Party were fighting in the north, and the Kurds took care of them pretty quickly. As you can see, unlike in the south, here it was wet, muddy, and cold. We weren't worried about WMDs, so we weren't wearing any chemical warfare gear, and as you can see, no Kevlar helmets, flak vests, or any other battle rattle. After being gassed, tortured, and persecuted for decades by Saddam Hussein, the Kurds were extremely happy to see us. We left in April after Baghdad was secured, Saddam Hussein had fled, and the war was over. If you were to tell us in the spring of 2003 that we would continue to remain there, fighting until December 18th, 2010, we would have been stunned. We all learned that fighting Saddam Hussein's military would turn out to be the easy part. After over 20 years of being an enlisted man, another happy day in my Air Force career occurred. This was the day, a year after I left Iraq, that my father and my mother pinned lieutenant bars on each of my shoulders. This was the day I became a commissioned officer. It turned out the Air National Guard would not give me an age waiver, but the Air Force Reserve would, hence my current status. I'm going to cut to the chase and simply talk about what I did this year, from February to August 2012. I was deployed to the Horn of Africa in the nation of Djibouti. Ostensibly, I was there to provide support to the African Union mission in Somalia, but I ended up doing quite a bit more, all of it very interesting and rewarding. This map is old. There is now a new country called South Sudan. Of course, lots of fighting has taken place there as well, but as you can see, Djibouti is located in quite a strategic location. From Djibouti, we were able to assist the new government in Yemen that has taken over this year from the corrupt autocrat that was in charge before. This guy, Hadi, is a tough character and has not only been cleaning up the government and the military, but really taken the fight to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is one of the strongest bases of Al-Qaeda in the world. And we are supporting him, providing him intelligence and things of that nature. In Somalia, you've had a group over the last several years called Al-Shabaab that has controlled most of Somalia. This year, Al-Shabaab linked up with Al-Qaeda. Al-Shabaab has been making incursions into Ethiopia and causing trouble there, creating a reaction from Ethiopia, where Ethiopia has invaded Somalia and taken the fight to Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab has been going into the Christian parts of Kenya and bombing churches there as well, and kidnapping Western tourists and aid workers and holding them for ransom. Last year, the Kenyans invaded Somalia, and this year bombed Al-Shabaab with their F-5 fighter jets, and sent their navy to shell their positions in the city of Kismayo, which is their last stronghold, or was their last stronghold. Meanwhile, Ethiopia has also been dealing with incursions from Eritrea, an isolationist dictatorship that has been labeled the North Korea of Africa. And Ethiopia has been busy skirmishing with the Eritreans over its disputed territory as well. So this is a very busy section of the world. Finally, the African Union mission in Somalia, or AMISOM, is in Somalia. AMISOM is led by the Ugandans and is also made up of Burundians and Rwandans. A few Djiboutians are in AMISOM as well. Between AMISOM, Ethiopia, and Kenya, I'm happy to report, as of last month, Al-Shabaab has been completely driven out of all of their strongholds in Somalia, and their leadership, as well as the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Somalia, has retreated across the sea into Yemen. For the first time since Black Hawk Down, if you guys remember that, there is actually a functioning government in Somalia. Mogadishu is clear, there's flights leaving in and out of there, and things have gotten better. One of the reasons there's been a success here is because the Africans have fought in Africa. We provided them with uniforms, with equipment, with training, and with intelligence support, but we let them do the fighting there, and it's been a success. Although radical jihadists have been driven out of Somalia, pirates still remain. Even their days are numbered, though. In Djibouti, we have a coalition of Ugandan, Ethiopian, Korean, Japanese, Spanish, German, English, French, Italian, and even Swedish militaries. They're all there present in Djibouti to do one thing: drive out the pirates. In 2010, 47 vessels were attacked by pirates. In 2012, the number so far has been 6. So clearly, anti-piracy is working as well. It is a criminal enterprise that has brought in billions of dollars over the years, but their days are numbered. In desperation, the pirates have sought to kidnap Westerners and hold them for ransom. In the fall of 2001, pirates kidnapped a Danish man who was helping to disarm and dispose of old landmines still left in the area. The Danish man was assisted by an American woman whom the pirates also kidnapped. Her name was Jessica Buchanan. After being held in captivity for 6 months, Jessica Buchanan became deathly ill. And so, fearing that she might soon die, earlier this year our SEALs went in and killed all of the pirates that were holding her and rescued her, and the Danish man who was lucky enough to be with her, bringing them both safely back to Djibouti and eventually home. About a week before she was rescued, though, pirates had captured another man. This man, Michael Scott Moore, was visiting the Somalian beaches to research a book he was writing on surfing in the area when he was kidnapped. Michael Scott Moore is the German-American dual citizen, and for obvious reasons, the pirates are negotiating with the German government for his release rather than ours. This recent picture of Mr. Moore shows that he is still apparently healthy. But if you hear anything about Mr. Moore in the news in the near future, hopefully it will not come now too much as a surprise, whatever happens. Finally, people have asked me what I've done in Djibouti. Well, here's one thing. Our pararescue men needed some training on water recovery, but we didn't have any helicopters with water recovery capability. The Marines were there with their helicopters, but they only had the land recovery. Fortunately, our Spanish allies did. So in order for our PJs to remain current on their capability, they had to do a simulated rescue. I told them that it could be done because I was networking with the Spanish crews. But the survivors were going to have to be one of my sergeants and myself. A few days later, we were getting into a Zodiac boat, motored off into the Gulf of Aden, inflated our life preservers, and floated off to be rescued. Another great day at the office. And you could see when the Spanish helicopter came in, there was our PJs who went in there and jumped in and recovered us. And one of the guys in the crew, he had a helmet cam, so you can see this here. He filmed it. You see the two orange vests, that's Sergeant Diffendafer and myself. They went to go after him first. He's about 110, 120 pounds soaking wet, so easy task. Unfortunately, the guy who was about 5'3" came swimming towards me, and so it was a little bit harder. The hoist was really working on this one. These guys are tough, though. They could probably pick up a guy twice as big as me. They're very, very strong. Although you can see them desperately trying to get to the lift of the helicopter there. But once he got me in there, he threw me in there like a sack of potatoes, so no sweat. All right, and I'm going to show one more video. It's a quick video just to show, again, what our PJs were doing there in Djibouti. I'm a big cheerleader for these guys. I was working with them. I was blessed to be working with them there in Djibouti. This is a simulated, what it was supposed to be a predator that had gone down in Somalia or Yemen or someplace, and there's sensitive equipment on board the predators that has to be recovered before the bad guys get it. So that was their mission, was to go in and get the sensitive information. See, it's the C-130. That device on the gentleman's wrist is an altimeter. It tells him when to pull the chute. Those are all Ramir chutes they use. A little bit different than some of the older guys may remember. Those circular chutes. They're a lot easier to control and maneuver. And now they're going to be approaching the simulated predator. So they've recovered the sensitive equipment. They were inserted by the 130s and the Marine helicopters come to pick them up. That's the paved low helicopter. It's about twice the size of our paved ones. There you go. They recover the stuff, they get refueled, and head back to base. Another mission accomplished. This is just a C-130 doing some light drops. As you can see, the terrain in Djibouti isn't too much different than it is in Iraq or Afghanistan. And that concludes my presentation. I appreciate everybody being here today, and I thank you all for coming, and thanks.
Thank you, Captain Yuers, for a very interesting and informative presentation, both with a lot of history and as to what we're doing in the present day, and as to some of the things that are going on in a part of the world that most of us are not very familiar with. So thank you for that. I think this is a stage we probably need the lights in the audience up. It is a city tradition in the weeks leading up to Veterans Day, and I do hope the lights will come up in the audience, to invite local veterans to share their story with us so that we can recognize them on this important day. And on behalf of the City of Walnut Creek, for those veterans who responded, it is my honor to recognize them with a special certificate of recognition in appreciation of their service. I'm going to introduce the ones that have come today or have submitted stories, and ask them to stand as I read a couple sentences about them, and then I'm going to ask you to recognize them with applause at the end. Earl Oram, Mr. Oram, standing in back, thank you. Enlisted in the United States Navy in 1950 and served during the Korean War. Mr. Oram was one of 5 brothers that served honorably our country, and at one time Mr. Oram's mother had 5 blue stars in her front window. The 5 brothers served in 2 different wars, and all 5 returned home safely. Thank you, Mr. Oram, and to your family. Edward Claire Calhoun. Standing in back, in the same section, please. Mr. Calhoun served in the United States Navy on the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown during the Korean War. He served as the division officer and as an education and training officer, and he also acted as defense counsel in 35 court-martial cases that were conducted aboard the carrier. Thank you, Mr. Calhoun. Bill Rett. I haven't quite seen him stand yet. Okay, thank you. Okay. Mr. Rett served for 37 years in the United States Navy and retired in 1990. He served as an air intelligence officer during the Korean War and during what Captain Yuers described and told us about in terms of the Cold War. Mr. Rett was one of the first of our troops to test radar technology and flew simulated bombing flights. He trained bombardier navigators how to drop bombs on targets using that same technology. Thank you, Mr. Rett. Peter Plant. I don't quite see him stand yet. Mr. Plant, I'll just read. He served in the U.S. Army from 1968 to 1972, and he also served in Korea as an infantry second lieutenant, and in Vietnam as a supply officer. We are also have several other veterans who served during World War II. Donald Weiss, he's here. Back row? Yes, sir. Thank you. Center section, back row. Mr. Weiss was called to active duty in 1941 and was among the first troops to be shipped overseas. He was a member of the weapons platoon and spent over 500 days in combat in the European theater. Thank you, Mr. Weiss. Ray Boylan, just a few rows in front of Mr. Weiss. Mr. Boylan joined the Marine Corps in 1948. He was wounded in Incheon, Korea, while in combat in the surrounding hills of the capital city of Seoul, South Korea. After returning home, he spent his career in New York City in law enforcement, but we're glad to have him in Walnut Creek to enjoy his retirement. And thank you, Mr. Boylan, for being here. Tom Martin. I don't quite see him stand yet. Mr. Martin joined the U.S. Navy in 1944 and served until the end of World War II. He enlisted again in the U.S. Navy from 1950 to 1953, serving during the Korean War as well. John Overton. I'll read Mr. Overton. Mr. Overton served in the U.S. Army for 42 years, both on active duty and in the reserves. He landed on the Japanese island of Okinawa on April 1st, 1945, and was wounded in June of that same year. Mr. Heber Smith. Okay, we have a couple people. I'll just read about him. He served in the Army Air Corps from 1943 to 45 and was a veteran of 35 combat missions over Europe during World War II. He flew his second combat mission on D-Day and his final mission on October 17th of that same year. John Fenske. I know he's here because I met him earlier. Mr. Fenske served in the United States Navy from 1943 to 1946. He was a third-class seaman and a signalman, and he participated in 7 landings in the Philippines. Thank you, Mr. Fenske. Shirley Garrison. She wrote in that she was a nurse in the U.S. Navy for 3.5 years and was just discharged as a full lieutenant in January 1946. E.F. McGuire served in the U.S. Army as a 4th grade technician and had 2 battle scars serving his country. Dan Franklin. Thank you, Mr. Franklin. Enlisted in 1942 in the United States Navy and served on an amphibious landing craft at Omaha Beach, D-Day, June 6, 1944. Thank you very much, Mr. Franklin. Hirsch Morton. Mr. Morton, standing in the center, about 10 rows back or 12 rows back, served in the U.S. Army Infantry as a radio man from 1943 to 1946 in the Italian mountains. He fought in 3 major battles, received a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. And after leaving the Army in 1945, he attended Cal State and practiced as an architect for many years in Lafayette, but presently resides and has resided in Rossmore since 1984. Thank you very much, Mr. Morton. We have 2 people whose families are here and wrote in about the experience of their family member. Mr. William is Susan. We're going to recognize Mr. William Ward, who served in the U.S. Air Force in World War II as an aerial gunner on a B-17 station in England. He passed away this past November, but he had lived here for 56 years. And we believe that his daughter, Susan, is with us today. There she is in the center. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you for what your father did. And finally, Mr. Frank Wigglesworth served in the U.S. Air Force in World War II as a tactical and strategic air commander. He retired from the Air Force in 1964, and I believe his daughter, Gail Pulley, is here. And thank you very much for being here. Nice. When Armistice Day was originally established, it was celebrated a bit differently than we celebrate veterans today. And I'm going to repeat a little part of that today. It was celebrated, in essence, by recognizing that 20 million people died in World War I. And the people, particularly in Europe, observed a minute of silence for all the men that fought in the war, and another minute for all the families that were affected by the absence and, in some cases, the death of those people who fought in the Great War. So I'm going to ask us to just observe a moment of silence in memory of all the veterans and their families that have served our country so well. We want to thank all of the veterans that are here today and their families for their service, and thank you very much for observing the moment of silence. We're now going to hear the band play the Armed Forces Salute. Before we close, and the close will be the Walnut Creek Concert Band will be conclude the ceremony by playing Semper Fidelis by John Philip Sousa. I want to thank and express our thanks and ask you to join us in applause. First to the keynote speaker again, Captain David Yuers, for his presentation. The Reverend Dr. Sumner Walters for his many wonderful thoughts about how we should observe this and his words of thanks, and very graciously done. Thank you, sir. And we've had a chance to give them some applause already, but one more round, please, for Harvey Benstein and the all-volunteer Walnut Creek Concert Band. I would also like to thank all the colleagues that joined me up on the stage today for being here and taking their time to honor our veterans. And then finally, I want to give thanks to the Boy Scout Troop 202 for the presentation of colors. And would you please rise now for the closing of the colors? And would you please recognize Boy Scout Troop 202? So the final thank you is to each of you for honoring us with your presence here today at this 2012 observance of our Veterans Day. And please join us in the back for a reception as we listen to our wonderful band play Semper Fidelis.